As we come into the 1980s, college campuses look a little different than they did a decade ago. What happened? Did all the disturbance end with the war in Vietnam?
All you Yale students, you gotta quit being students, you gotta give up being students, and you gotta become full-time revolutionaries. And we gotta make the revolution everywhere.
The protests of the 60s didn't just happen. An issue pushed by effective organizers and publicized by mass demonstrations turned the so-called New Left into a major force in America. The issue, Vietnam, seems to have disappeared. But what about the leaders? Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman,
we're going to do a lot of freaky things. We're going to get the Pentagon to rise in the air.
And Tom Hayden.
Political education that goes on while we are forming the brigades. We're going to invade Yale with troops just like we invaded Cambodia.
Some, like Lee Weiner and John Freunds, two more of the Chicago Seven, as well as the controversial Sam Brown, have moved into policy-making positions in the government. Their issues may have changed, and a few of them have drifted away, but much of the New Left's leadership has remained. Tom Pauken has been studying the movement since its inception in the 60s. He has written and spoken extensively on the activities of the New Left.
Most of us who entered college in the early 1960s didn't realize what was to come. We had a new president, John Kennedy, the youngest in modern times. Most of the young people who were politically active on the campuses were conservatives, whose heroes were Bill Buckley and Barry Goldwater. But then in November 1963, John Kennedy was assassinated. A year later, Barry Goldwater was overwhelmingly defeated in his bid for the presidency. And by 1965, the war in Vietnam had gotten out of control. The time was ripe for the emergence of the New Left. The New Left really got its start back in June 1962 when a group of students calling themselves the Students for a Democratic Society issued a statement of principles known as the Port Huron Statement. The author of that statement was a young University of Michigan graduate student named Tom Hayden. And using SDS as his base, Hayden would emerge as the principal leader of the New Left movement.
For a while, the New Left floundered in search of an issue that would work for them nationally. Then Vietnam came along. The Vietnam War was the ideal issue. The war dragged on and became more and more unpopular. It could be made into a very emotional issue, since the facts were hard to come by. So large numbers of students, directly affected by the war, could be recruited into what appeared to be simply an anti-war movement. But most important, the issue was one that could be used to discredit our American system. There were a great many people who opposed the war for a variety of legitimate reasons. The New Left was different. They wanted and worked for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to win. Those who were most directly affected by the actions of the New Left were American prisoners of war in Vietnam. Ken Tomlinson, a senior editor of Reader's Digest, covered the war and is co-author of the book POW, a study of those prisoners.
Ken, what was the reaction of our POWs to the visiting American delegations to Hanoi during the Vietnam War?
It was a very, very difficult situation for them, Tom. They could understand demonstrations in the United States against the war. They could understand the democratic process at work in the United States. What they couldn't understand is Americans coming to Hanoi in a period when they were undergoing extreme torture. The camps in Hanoi underwent some great cleanups in the days and hours before visiting Americans came. And some American prisoners underwent some horrendous torture during the days and hours before visiting American delegations arrived.
Colonel George Day enlisted in the Marines in World War II, served in Korea, and went to Vietnam in 1967 as an Air Force pilot. He was shot down and captured. He escaped and was recaptured and remained in a communist prison camp for nearly 6 years. He is one of 2 POWs who received the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Colonel Day, what kept the American prisoners of war going? What let them survive, and survive in an honorable way?
I think it was a combination of several things. Religion, strong belief in God, conviction that this was a great country, that it was well worth coming back to. The Vietnamese system was so bad, that communism was such a stinking armpit, so rotten by comparison, that it drove a lot of people into a very pro-U.S. position.
What kind of treatment did you receive in North Vietnam?
Well, it could be best characterized as savage, barbaric, brutal, inhuman. From the time I got up there until after Ho Chi Minh died, there were repeated attempts to coerce prisoners and force prisoners to make anti-war statements and to meet American delegations.
Bud, what effect did the visit of the American delegations to Hanoi have on the American POWs who were prisoners there?
It was very bad. Our people took it very badly. We had a great deal of broadcasts from the various Americans. Tom Hayden was on the radio, Jane Fonda, Ramsey Clark, Dave Dillinger. All of the anti-war types were sometime or another on the radio, and in some cases they showed some film with these people in them. The film that we saw, Jane Fonda, was one where she was harping about how we were illegally bombing dikes. And in the same piece of film footage that you could see the dike and her, and you could also see a gun position which was located on the dike. So they had a pretty fair target up on that dike. They did a marvelous job for the Vietnamese. They were very morale destroying for us. We couldn't believe that Americans would be over there doing treasonous, making treasonous statements against the country as they were. They encouraged the Vietnamese to keep fighting. It went far beyond just the realm of protest against the war. It was active aid and encouragement to an enemy who was killing our people in the South. There were a lot of Americans that died because of Jane Fonda, Ramsey Clark, Sloan Coffin's visit to North Vietnam.
Back in the United States, Jane Fonda was quoted as saying that those POWs who said they were tortured by the North Vietnamese communists were liars and hypocrites. What's your reaction to that?
Well, Jane Fonda is an outrageous liar. She bleated about how that war was killing people in Southeast Asia. There's never been a word from her since the North Vietnamese communists started murdering millions of people in Southeast Asia. Never a comment of any kind in protest of that. Not a word about those 4 or 5 million Cambodians who were brutalized. Not a word about the poor boat people who have been robbed and then put out to sea to die. She's a hypocrite and a liar.
More pilots had wanted to meet with me. It wasn't possible.
In addition to the propaganda broadcast she made in Hanoi, Jane Fonda shot 8mm movies, which she showed at press conferences.
Do you consider yourself a revolutionary?
Yes, I do.
She had left no doubt as to her political
What kind of a
feelings.
revolutionary? I believe that we must have a rapid and fundamental change of the economic structure of our country.
Shortly after her return, Fonda married Tom Hayden, the New Left's leading strategist. Tom Hayden was a successful organizer during the 60s. From a few hundred students, SDS grew into hundreds of chapters on campuses across the country. His organization in Newark helped trigger the bloody riots of 1967. Hayden called the shots in the 1968 SDS takeover of Columbia University, and he was a principal leader in the demonstrations at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. He was one of the Chicago Seven. Prior to those demonstrations, Hayden told a news conference, "Responsibility for any violence that develops lies with the authorities, not the demonstrators." There was violence. And Hayden, along with Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, and the rest of the Chicago Seven, were tried for conspiracy. 5 of them, including Hayden and Rubin, were found guilty of inciting to riot, but their convictions were overturned on appeal. On March 8, 1976, Jerry Rubin wrote in the Chicago Sun-Times that they were all guilty as hell. Singer Joan Baez is a pacifist and campaigned actively against the Vietnam War. But in the summer of 1979, she wrote an open letter to the communist government in Hanoi, protesting its denial of human rights. She asked friends and leaders of the anti-war movement to co-sign the letter. Most did. But then most had protested for legitimate humanitarian reasons. Among those who refused were the leaders of the New Left. Jane Fonda and William Kunstler, who had been the attorney for the Chicago Seven, even attacked Miss Baez for making the communist regime look bad.
I'm Joan Baez, and we called the press conference to announce a free concert by myself tomorrow evening, July the 19th at 8 o'clock at the Lincoln Memorial. And it is really a very human plea to find a way to rescue the boat people of Indochina.
I have a sort of a two-part question. First of all, you had a major role in the anti-war movement in the 60s, and I think many of your friends now feel that what you're doing today contradicts the efforts that you and many other people made. The second question...
Can we do one at a time?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. First of all, today's issue really is the boat people, and it is not the open letter, although at another time I'd be very happy to discuss the open letter with you. But I think what I was about all through the 60s was saving babies, and that's exactly what I'm about today.
Ms. Baez,
yes?
Why do you think that Jane Fonda has been so critical of your activities?
I think she is ideologically bound up in leftism in a way that I'm not. I think that's as simple as answers I can give. I'm not going to agree with her politically, probably.
Well, you're consistent philosophically because you call yourself a pacifist, and your actions have been consistent over the years. Aren't Jane's actions somewhat inconsistent?
I can't tell. Not really. I mean, she was, all the people in the 60s were called anti-war. In fact, that isn't really true. They're anti that war. Most people are anti-specific wars, but most people reserve in themselves a place where they can justify certain violence. My feeling is that Jane would be in that category, certainly with a picture of her holding the M16 or whatever it was in Vietnam. She reserved that place in her, that she was justifying the violence of the Viet Cong. Now, I never took that position. When I was in Vietnam, I discussed pacifism and nonviolent resistance with the Vietnamese. It's a position that I hold, and when they showed pictures of, sort of propaganda pictures of Viet Cong training, I left the room. I hate it. I'm not interested in it. I was never enamored of that kind of stuff on any side. My feeling is that what we did there really dug up the earth, and I don't think we're divorced from that. At the same time, that doesn't tie my hands from accusing the Vietnamese government of what they're doing and saying, come on, fellas.
No more weeping and no more mourning. Hallelujah. No more sickness and no more drowning. Hallelujah. Michael rose aboard ashore. Hallelujah. Michael rose aboard ashore. Hallelujah.
Vietnam is no longer of interest to the New Left. What has happened in Indochina since the communist takeover has been an embarrassment to them, as millions of people have fled for safety. Things didn't work out as the New Left had promised. So now they need a new issue, and apparently a new organization. In the 1960s, it was the SDS. Now it's the CED. Hayden's organization for the 80s is the Campaign for Economic Democracy. His aides call CED the Radical Machine. And already they've elected candidates to local office in California and spearheaded drives for rent control legislation. Governor Brown has even appointed Hayden as his personal representative on the Southwest Regional Border Commission. They're trying a number of political issues in an attempt to find one which will work as well in the 80s as Vietnam did in the 60s. At this point, Hayden seems to believe that issue will be nuclear power. On May 6, 1979, Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda led an anti-nuclear demonstration in Washington, D.C. To those who had been there before, it looked like a scene from the 1960s. Along the way, the New Left had lost a few spokesmen and picked up a few new ones, but the leadership remained basically the same. Kevin Phillips is a highly regarded political analyst. As editor and publisher of the American Political Report, his evaluations are read and respected by leaders of both political parties.
Mr. Phillips, the New Left was a major force in the 1960s, seemed to have faded in the 1970s, and appears now to perhaps be making a comeback. What's your view about this?
I think the New Left went into abeyance to some extent after the war in Vietnam, and I think they're finding a new handle now with a combination of economic populism, anti-nuclear activism, and I think it's working for them fairly well.
Robert Novak is an award-winning columnist who teams with Roland Evans to write their nationally syndicated column. Mr. Novak has written a number of books and articles on American politics.
Mr. Novak, you have interviewed Tom Hayden and written about the Tom Hayden, Jane Fonda political organization. What are your impressions of that organization?
I think he has national dimensions of an organization which is essentially, although he certainly won't call it that, a socialist organization, and one which would definitely move as expeditiously as possible to erode the capitalist system.
Well, along those lines, in the 1960s, Tom Hayden classified himself as a revolutionary. He seems much more cautious nowadays in what he says. Do you think he's changed his belief or just simply changed his tactics?
He's changed his tactics, which is not a very uncommon procedure among revolutionaries, so-called or not. I think he felt that his organization, the SDS, and its later offshoot, its very violent offshoot, the Weatherman, show that in a society of this kind, which is not Nicaragua, which is not Iran, you cannot win a revolution in the streets, at least not now. But he does feel that because of public discontent, you can use certain public resentments and public apprehensions to score some political victories. And obviously he is not moving on issues which are unpopular.
Lisa, as a active member of the anti-nuclear movement, what was your reaction to the May demonstration in Washington?
Well, I was happy to see that many people turned out for it, but there were many. I had mixed opinions about having all the celebrities supporting the anti-nuclear. I'm glad that they're supporting it, but I wish that more workers and more of the non-known people would come out and be actively supportive of it.
What are your impressions of the involvement of Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda in the movement?
I think that I have wavering feelings about it, but I'm glad that they're part of it. I'm definitely glad, and I think that the fact of who they are, and especially Jane Fonda, will affect some of the people who follow her, and if that's the way we're going to get people to come out and support the anti-nuclear demonstration, then that's good enough for me.
Apparently some people who were part of the anti-nuclear movement were unhappy with the May demonstration. Were there any reasons for this?
Well, they questioned who exactly was behind the organizing of the demonstration. It was never really clear. Whenever it was asked who was actually organizing, it was just the May 6th coalition, but we never really knew who the May 6th coalition represented.
Do you know now who the leadership of that demonstration was?
No, we just know that these celebrities came out to support it with them, but we don't know who was behind it, no.
Art Litoff attended the Washington demonstration. He lives near the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant and considers himself a moderate. We talked with him 3 months after the TMI incident.
What is the role, Art, of a moderate in a protest like this?
I think the role of a moderate is a very difficult one. With this march in Washington, there were other groups that were probably more newsworthy simply because they were radical, because they were outlandish. They either dressed in an outlandish manner, some of the chants contained vulgar words, or they were groups that had very little relationship to the nuclear protest.
What about Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda, who've been called leaders of the anti-nuclear movement?
Well, leaders, they are the spokespeople, and it's inevitable that people who are already well known will rise to the top and have their faces on camera and have their voices in the news more than the rest of us. Perhaps some of the rest of us might be more familiar with the facts, and perhaps some of the rest of us might be more moderate. We might want to be more constructive in our criticism.
What do you think Tom Hayden's after?
Power. He wants the country to exist as he wants the country to be restructured along a public ownership lines with a gradual socialization or semi-socialization of the economic structure.
His position is not going to be, I think, well received in too many primaries if he verbalizes it. I think what they have to do is mount more of a covert political game where they team up with other economic organizations and labor unions and activist groups.
Whatever works. And that is the great difference between what they're doing and what they did in the Vietnam movement. In the Vietnam movement, naturally they hoped that Vietnam and the growing public opposition to the war would eventually lead to a revolutionary atmosphere. But whether it did or not, they were stuck on that issue. I mean, they were for that issue on inherent grounds. I believe now they will take whatever works. And if the nuclear issue does not begins to flag off, as I think it will, because I think it's essentially a safe form of power, and there are unlikely to be a great profusion of accidents unless accidents are promoted, I think they'll go to other issues.
I think the best thing the man has going for him in his life is Jane Fonda's money and Jane Fonda's looks, and the rest of it I wouldn't push up quite that high.
I want to just say a few words about the China Syndrome, my movie, The China Syndrome, because...
Hayden takes full advantage of Miss Fonda's popularity, something he didn't have in the 60s. A highly skilled actress, Miss Fonda now concentrates on films that carry a political message.
Where does the Jane Fonda films fit into all of this?
Well, I believe that they work hand in hand. I think they really prepare the public for a political movement of this kind because they tend to be much more sophisticated than the proletarian propaganda films before World War II, where you had, in a sense, essentially the far left making rather strident propaganda movies about the plight of the poor coal miners. China Syndrome, which is a very good adventure film. I don't know if you saw it, but I was really taken with it as a very exciting melodrama. Is essentially not so much, in my opinion, an anti-nuclear film as an anti-capitalist film. And the capitalists are characterized, they are shown to be anti-humanitarian, they're shown to be brutal, shown to be tied up with the police state.
Even Abby Hoffman, now a fugitive under indictment for peddling drugs, risked granting a radio interview at the May 6th rally, an indication of the importance the New Left's leadership puts on the issue.
So I think we're headed for a clash. I don't think that this is the clash, and I think at some point people are going to have to put their bodies on the line.
Whatever works. It's interesting to notice that when Tom Hayden wrote the Port Huron statement, he said, "With nuclear energy, whole cities may be powered." But he's not speaking favorably of it now. The New Left needs the issue. Again, as in the 60s, facts are hard to come by, so the issue can be turned into an emotional one. There's a new crop of young people who may be aroused into supporting what appears to be simply a protest against possible danger. And again, what is most important, it can be used, and is being used, to discredit the American system.
Let me tell you what's going on in Asia. It's a genocidal war against us. With our parents send us over there to die because they want to kill us.
That's what they wanted then,
This reminds me of the best days of the 1960s in more ways than one.
And that's what they want now. And they will use whatever works.
I love the country. I believed in it. I felt that this system worked. As I looked at theirs, I knew theirs didn't. I had a very, very strong, firm belief in God. And I just never doubted that my country would come to its senses.